Hey there, welcome to First Look. How are you all doing today? So, I guess this is the cozy edition because I just decided to do this in a hoodie. So this week we have a couple of really special things. And so I'm going to come at this at kind of a special angle because why not? The first one is that this week we have a very special guest. And so preaching is Susan Meyer, who was the associate pastor here in the 80s and 90s. And Susan is someone that we have seen before. I've had the privilege of hearing before. It was almost a year ago, actually, for the Presbyterian Women's Service. So this year she's here as a part of our 100th anniversary series. And it's a real privilege having Susan because she's someone who I think comes at preaching and ministry from a unique perspective because she moved from ordained ministry in the church into more therapeutic practice, counseling practice. And that perspective, I think, is extraordinarily valuable. And, we need as much as we can get our hands on when it comes to a well-rounded understanding of who God is and how we are to respond to God. And the fact that Susan brings the church experience and the counseling experience is really remarkable. So we're really grateful that she's able to come and to do this and to be a part of that, and that's a really great thing. So we have that, which is great. The second thing second and third, I guess I'll put them together, is that this week is we do two things. Every year I've been here, just about, we've done two things on the same week. So usually what happens is that on the third week of October, we have our Stewardship Sunday. That's where I preach the sermon based on the theme and passage for our stewardship campaign. And every year that's a little different based on our needs and based on what's happening and based on just where we feel like we're at. This year being a unique one, again, 100th anniversary, we talked about wisdom moving forward, that looking at the kind of the broader perspective of our stewardship. And I had a lot of, it was a really nice week in terms of the writing because it really allowed me to think about this broader perspective on what that looks like. So we looked at that. So then the week after, we have our stewardship sermon. We have what we call Pledge Sunday, and that always also falls on Reformation Sunday. It's a busy season. And I like the fact that those two come in tandem. So Pledge Sunday simply being where in the middle of the service, during the hymn, I think it's the hymn right after the sermon, people are invited to bring up their pledges, and we have this special box from Malawi that we put the pledges in. And so we're singing and we're doing something worshipful during that time, and then it's all sort of under the umbrella of Reformation. And both of those things, pledges and Reformation, say a lot about who we are. And the biggest thing, of course, of the pledge is one, that's us bringing a part of who we are, what we think, what we have, what our hopes for are, how we feel dedicated to a place, and recognizing that all of that is responsive. So I think when we talk about the Reformation, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of different ways today, When we talk about the Reformation, of course, what we mean is the Protestant Reformation. Okay, there are multiple reformations, but when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, what we usually refer to is a moment in time in the 1500s when you could say that the Protestant church was born, right? You have Martin Luther, you have the 95 Theses, which is a kind of a declaration by Martin Luther, who was a scholar in the church at the time, about basically where the church collectively had been going wrong and where it needed some reform. Now, to say reform doesn't mean we're breaking the church in two and we're going to do one thing and start something else over here. The idea was to change the church, to reform the church from within. That was the concept. And what, of course, happened was a kind of schism, right? The Protestant church is born, the Catholic Church remains. But ultimately, what we also understand is that the church, capital C, Christ Church, is not divided. There's not like Christ Church, it's within the church. There is Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, etc. And I think that that's an important thing to remember. And it's one of those things that I hear often as I think kind of a misnomer, that somehow there's Christianity and Catholicism are sort of the same but not the same, which is not true. Christianity is all churches that proclaim Christ as Lord. And so Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, etc., all do that. And so what we have are different ways of understanding how that should work. And that, working that out over the last 500 plus years has taken a lot of blood, sweat, and toil, and will continue to. But it's a process of declaring over and over and over again what it is that we believe, what we think about who God is, what we think about who we are as individuals and as a collective body, and how it is that we're supposed to faithfully respond to the things that God is doing in the world. And we live in a world where we are certainly fractured and polarized in some ways, and believe and think very different things. But we are also people that come together very regularly to either see our similarities or celebrate our differences, and a lot of other things in between. And I think that as we think about what it means to be a part of that Reformation, that's a big part of how we see ourselves. We see ourselves as a one piece of a very complicated and very layered change in how we understand God, which was always going to change. From the very beginning, any scripture that you've ever read, Paul and the other writers of Scripture are constantly talking to the churches that are under Peter is doing this and John is doing this, are constantly telling the people there are going to be a lot of differences in the way that people talk about God, and we need you to know who we are and why we do what we do. Because at some point you're going to have to understand that, so that when you have a question or when you're not sure what to do or whatever, that you know where to come back to. So that's always been true. Read any of Paul's letters or those attributed to Paul or his disciples, and you will over and over and over again, see that happen. Well, they say this and they say this, but we say this and this is why. And okay, so it's always been true. So within the Reformation, we also have a group within that, and Presbyterians are a group within that consider themselves to be what we call Reformed. So that's confusing. There's the Reformation, and then we're the Reformed. Now, there's a complicated kind of history to that, obviously, but these were the folks who kind of really took on that mantle of of using that term and saying, we are going to talk about God in very specific terms. So Anglican is not Reformed, Baptist is not Reformed, but things like Lutheran and Presbyterian and the United Church of Christ and other things that maybe you've heard of are Reformed. And it's not because their worship is radically different. You know, if I was in a Methodist church and a Presbyterian church, you would see probably very similar things. That's why this is all confusing and why I thought I would take this particular week to just talk about a little bit about what that looks like, and maybe whet your appetite when it comes to looking at some of these things for yourself. Because all of this has to do with trying to decipher and recognize and declare and celebrate who we are. And on this Sunday that we call Reformation Sunday, that's the reason why we do that. So, again, there's the greater Reformation, Protestant, Catholic. Okay, and then within that Reformation, again, there are different ways of thinking about God, different ways of thinking about the sacraments, different ways of thinking about salvation, different language that we use for things. Okay, so you have within the Reformation, then you have things like Anglican, which has its own terminology, which becomes Methodist in the United States, Episcopal, that kind of thing. Presbyterian, Lutheran, which is what we call Reformed, which we'll talk about. Baptist, and several different types of Baptist, and then that evolves into many other things. But the group within the Reformation that called themselves Reformed, of which Presbyterians are one, was a group of people that were scattered in different regions like Scotland, England, Switzerland, Germany, different countries like that. And in those countries, again, this is like 16th, 17th century, started to write, started to come together, figure out who we were, what made us unique within the Reformation, and how we are going to talk about ourselves in comparison to others. And so throughout the centuries, a lot of them were written in those first couple hundred years after the Martin Luther beginning of things that I mentioned before. There were different declarations that were made, what they called confessions, which spoke to kind of a defining statement of who we are. And so the Presbyterian Church has adopted in a collection called the Book of Confessions several of these documents. And some of them you have heard and that you think of as very plain. You've heard of the Apostles' Creed, you've heard of the Nicene Creed, right? Those are very old and were adopted because they speak very plainly and succinctly about how we define God, salvation, our mission in the world, the church's response to that salvation, etc. And those are unbelievably important things because they say what it is that we believe based on the way we understand Scripture. And then after that, again, 16th, 17th century, we see different documents coming out of these areas. I talked about England, Scotland, Germany, Switzerland, that defined what the Reformed churches like the Presbyterian Church, would say about themselves. And some of them were meant to be very politically charged, very clearly against the powers that be. And other ones were used for teaching. You may have heard of the term catechism. Okay, longer or shorter catechisms, and we have Heidelberg. In Heidelberg, there was a catechism. In Westminster, there was a catechism. These are teaching tools, right? So it's a kind of a question and answer, like kind of format. So we had documents like that, and then you move further along, and in the 20th century, we had different types of declarations and confessions. We had the Barmen Confession, which was written in clear defiance of Nazi Germany. And you'll notice there's a banner that commemorates the Barmen Confession, which is very striking. In our, you can probably guess which one that is if you've seen it. And then we had other ones that were written in the United States, like Barmen was written in Germany, but the Confession of 1967, which was written during Civil Rights, which was the first to be included from the United States. We had another one called A Brief Statement of Faith, which was written in the early 80s, which was adopted by the Presbyterian Church when we combined in the early 80s, like to become the PCUSA as we are now. And we just adopted one which is going to fly, the name is going to fly out of my head, from South Africa, which was written in direct opposition to apartheid. And halfway through this, I'll remember the name of that. So we have Belhar, there it is, the Belhar Confession, I told you. So there are a lot of different types of confessions that sometimes are written in defiance of things, apartheid, Nazi, okay. And sometimes because we're celebrating something that we're trying to promote, like the coming together of the different denominations. And all of these confessions, and a confession again is just a statement of a truth that we understand about ourselves. All of these statements that vary in length. Some of them are just a couple paragraphs. Some are a few pages. Some are dozens and dozens of pages. They all are in one way, shape, or form saying the same thing, which is we want to state very clearly the way we think about God. We want to state what the church should be. And we want to say what we don't believe in. You know, we want to reject certain things. We want to distance ourselves from certain things. And some of them use very, very, what we would feel are very, very harsh language about we are not that. So whatever that is, we're not that. We are this. And so I'm saying all this, again, like this, because this is the week that we're talking about it. And the part of the reason that I'm focusing on the other elements of the service rather than what Susan might be preaching on is that I thought, well, there's enough for me to talk about just between you and I, just in these two areas of pledge and Reformation. And so I hope you can kind of start to see and think about why putting Pledge Sunday and Reformation Sunday together is for me, it feels like an important and symbolic thing to do, because we celebrate and commemorate the Reformation, knowing that it is a complicated past. We happen to be Protestant. We happen to be Presbyterian. We happen to live in the United States. But we know that from throughout our history as Christians, that is a very complicated past. One with a lot of wonderful things and a lot of terrible things, complicated things, muddled things, things that aren't always as pure and simple as we want them to be, or we wish that they were, or we might say that they are. The history of the church is one of a lot of things. And recognizing that that's true is a part of how I think we live into that confessional, that truth-telling kind of the life that I believe that we're supposed to. And being a part of a church, so shrinking that down, being a part of one individual church is also the same thing. Northmont or any other church that you or your family has been a part of is a complicated thing. There's some wonderful things about its history, and there's some complicated things about its history. Things that didn't go the way that you hoped that they would go. And the living and learning and sometimes apologizing and sometimes celebrating parts of that are who we are. So you go from something that feels really big like the church to the Protestant church, to the Reformed church, to the Presbyterian church, to your church, to you specifically. You are a complicated mixture of things. You are wonderful and humble and funny and wise and all those things that you are. But you are also one who very willingly comes and confesses every week. We have that as a part of our tradition for a reason. Because none of us are perfect, and some of us have really gone astray at times. And we are a mixed bag, right? And so as we bring that pledge of ourselves, we bring all of that. We bring all of who we are into that moment and say, regardless of the fact that I am a lot of different things, good and bad, I'm going to trust in God. I'm going to trust in others. I'm going to try to love as unconditionally as I know how. And try to be generous. And so we take that, we're a part of all of that, and that's the kind of the beauty of it, that we get a chance to celebrate all of that at once. So when I send you this, when you watch this, you'll probably see in the email, or you'll go back and look at the email I sent you, that there's a link to, you can just click on it, to the Book of Confessions. You can also, if you want a copy of it, we have plenty of copies in the church, or we can get you one electronically or paperback or whatever you'd like. And it has within it all of these statements, and some that I didn't mention, all of these statements that you can read for yourself. And I hope that at some point you'll at least peruse it, even if you don't read it line by line, word for word. But each one comes with a kind of introduction, so you understand the context in which it was written, the terms in which they're used, that kind of thing. Because there's stuff in there you're not going to know. I mean, there's stuff in there I don't know well at all or understand for myself. So there's some context there. And then you can read through those sections line by line. And it's again, It's one of those things that if you read any of it, you'll have a bigger and broader understanding of who we are as people of faith. So I'm going to include that. And if you would like some help or you want any kind of guide or aid, I'd be happy to help you with that. So that's what I wanted to cover, because I wanted us to think through our past, and I want us to think through our present. And I hope that that helps to inform where we're going. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Susan is going to be bringing for us. I look forward to worshiping with you and thinking about these things a little bit more intentionally. I appreciate you doing this with me, and I hope that you, in the meantime, have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time for another First Look. So until then, take care.